Hi team. In this video, I'll be interviewing a self-funded searcher after he successfully closed on his first business. I'm excited to reintroduce Mason, who I interviewed almost 2 years ago when he first stepped out to pursue entrepreneurship through acquisition, which basically means you're a one-man private equity shop. Mason acquired HurtVet in March of 2022, a government contractor focused on fire, life safety, and security services. And he currently acts as its president and majority owner. If you want his full background, I suggest going back to the original interview. But I think it's important to know that Mason didn't have a private equity or investment banking background when he set out to buy this business. In this interview, we're going to be talking about the business he acquired, what it took to raise capital as a first-time searcher, how he perfected his pitch to business owners when he's competing against private equity funds, and what he would have done differently if he had to go back and do it all over again. So let's dive in. Yeah, so tell us about the first company you acquired, what made it an attractive opportunity for you, and I think you had a few advantages in this process. Would love to dive into those as well.
So we are a government contractor. We exclusively sell to or work for the federal government. We are a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, an SDVOSB. That's a special socioeconomic designation that confers some special contracting advantages. And the specific services we provide are fire, life safety, and security services. So think about VA hospitals, big military bases, or large office buildings for any branch of the federal government. Those buildings all have fire alarm systems, sprinkler systems, security cameras, and so on. And those systems all need to be routinely tested, inspected, maintained, and at times repaired. So that's the kind of stuff that we do.
So it's really fantastically stable. I mean, that's got to be a very attractive quality going into something. You're looking for something that has potential to grow, but your baseline's really covered.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of really interesting technology in the space and innovation in the space. But in terms of, thinking about industries that are primed for disruption, buildings are never going to suddenly not have a fire alarm system or suddenly not have sprinklers. And it will be a very long time, if ever, for the code to change such that we think these things are just bulletproof forever and never need to be touched, never need to be tested, never need to confirm that they're still working as designed.
But if anything, safety regulation sort of always expands, right? Or at least that's been my thought. We looked at like fall harnesses for people cleaning the outsides of skyscrapers. And the idea was like, it's never going to be less. You're only going to be looking for more safety, more control, more compliance. Or at least that's my thought. I don't know if that's a concern of yours.
Yeah, I think you've always got some, especially serving the federal government or being in a regulated industry, you got some thoughts on stroke of the pen risk. What if something changes and what if the requirements become less stringent? But I've done some research into the history and that has very much not been the case. It's just gotten stricter and more stringent. Yeah. And being in the business for a couple of years, I see that as a continuing trend. No one wants to really... I think there are plenty of people who want to say we need less regulation, we need deregulation, so on and so forth. But I don't think anybody is quite at the point where they want to say, yeah, fire seems like something we can play fast and loose with the rules on. It'll be fine. Yeah.
For people listening in, I love that you brought up stroke of the pen risk because I always talk about it, but I feel like it gets overlooked all the time. When you're dealing with government contracts, government programs, explain stroke of the pen risk.
The government generally has one operating model that says, you must have this kind of license or certification to operate in this industry, or you have to do things a certain way. And that with a different legislature, with a different executive, et cetera, the government writ large makes a decision that changes the rules or changes the landscape. And that could potentially negatively impact your specific competitive edge. Where if they say, hey, you got to have, hypothetically, you got to have 3 engineers of varying disciplines in your company to serve X niche, and you're one of 2 companies that has 3 engineers, hey, you're one of 2 or 3. That's great. And then that engineer requirement gets yanked out. All of a sudden you have 10, 20, 30 competitors flocking to the market. That's what we think of as stroke of the pen risk, is some kind of regulation or even legislation changing the landscape of your business, where some of your advantages that you've worked hard to create and protect go away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gets overlooked a lot. So I just always find it interesting as something to explain. And as it relates to the founder, how did he grow this? How did he scale it?
That's something that I find just interesting in search in general is the mindset, mentality, and skill set of somebody who can or does take something from 0 to 1 or 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 versus the mindset, skill set of somebody who can inherit something midstream. So, I mean, first and foremost, the seller is just a tremendously hard worker. The guy grinds on a level that, you know, puts Wall Street junior bankers to shame. And he's been doing it since he was 18 and he's in his mid 50s and just does not have an off switch.
My partner at Hilltop, Mark Plunkett, whenever we were working with founder CEOs, he'd always say that the entire private equity community completely underestimates how much work it takes to get that first dollar when you're building something. Like you have to develop infrastructure, develop a product, trust, brand, and then go to a customer. And it is an absolute grind. And I think the people who do that are very persistent thereafter. They know what it took them to start, and they're so afraid of losing it that you just have that grind in you.
Yeah, I think he's got that. He's got a tremendous amount of, at this point, very much so, justifiable self-confidence. And I think what helped him move from solopreneur status to a real business, and what I ultimately came to appreciate as we were doing the deal, is that he's just a high integrity individual. You know, he's a straight shooter, sometimes to a fault. He'll admit that, and you know, saying things in a small business context.
Do you have any real blunt conversations with him?
Yeah, very, very blunt conversations. You know, at some point I'll tell you a story that he told me about being a flight instructor and you know, students who need a hug versus students who need a clipboard thrown at their head. They're wearing helmets, so it's safe. But he's a blunt guy, but straight shooter, never questioned his ethics, and I think that helped him identify, for the most part, you know, everybody makes mistakes, but I think that helped him identify the right team to bring along and help him develop some followership and build a good team that I was able to inherit and, you know, adjust and build on.
Absolutely. And one thing I'm very curious about, and I think a lot of people are, as a first-time searcher, what's it like convincing someone like that to work with you and to transact with you? I guess, what's it like to work with someone who's built a business, come in and say, you're doing this for the first time, you have private equity options available to you, but I'm the right candidate, I'm the right option?
Yeah. So in a word, hard. Generally, it is not easy. And that's, you know, something where you develop your pitch over dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, potentially, of no's.
So I'd love to dive in on that. The number of calls, the number of times you heard no before you heard yes. I think it's one of the most defeating things for people out there. And I've seen so many people who they come in when we were funding independent sponsors. They'd come in and they'd say, "This is my precise criteria. I'm only transacting on on these variables." And we would meet with them 2 years later, and they're looking at a fully auctioned deal from some boutique investment bank, willing to pay full price because they've just tired. They've gotten too tired. And everything is about your entry and your partnership. So tell us about that process. How many times you heard no, and what allowed you to persist?
I legitimately lost count in the first few weeks. It is undoubtedly in the thousands. I can't necessarily say I've had thousands of individual phone conversations, but in terms of email rejections, phone, you know, being screened out by brokers, being, you know, having what I thought was a good conversation and then being ghosted, it is relentless. And it's helped me develop a ton of empathy and respect for salespeople. But it is really hard. But getting back to your point of, you know, what's it like to convince someone to sell their company to you? How do you make that pitch? This is where I think a lot of folks, it takes a while to find your footing because you're stumbling over yourself. You're, you know, bargaining and negotiating against yourself, of telling them about, you know, all the downsides of going to you to try to disarm them. It's tough. And I think a lot of folks make the mistakes of pushing too hard to try to pretend they're something or someone that they're not. You have a lot of folks in the search world, especially, and I think even in the independent sponsor world, who feel uncomfortable with the reality of where they are. So they try to kind of dress themselves up to be mini private equity or micro private equity. And
would you say that's a mistake? I feel like one of the differentiating factors is that you're not private equity. You're in this, you want to buy a business, you want to run this for life. And so if someone really cares about their company and their employees, it's a different option. It's a different alternative.
Yeah, I do think it's a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake to try to present professionalism and dedication and intentionality, but I think it's a huge mistake to try to pretend that you have a big fund behind you.
Yeah.
I think it's a mistake to pretend that you are a private equity firm if you are truly, a one man, one woman show. I think you need to lead with what you are and be honest about what you're not. And that will result in a lot of no's because there are a lot of folks who are trying to make a strategically or financially optimized transaction. I'm like, hey, you don't have deep pockets, I'm not interested. But you will find that right product market fit or seller buyer fit of someone who does have that deep care about legacy, about their personnel, and doesn't think of their involvement in their business as only financial.
Yeah. And once you had your pitch perfected, like your process, what did it look like? What would you say that had the biggest impact on the founder?
It was definitely multimodal throughout the process. So I really benefited from taking a sales class while I was in grad school that helped me understand more about the basics of sales. Yeah. And my perspective is that as a searcher, first and foremost, you are a salesperson. You're a salesperson a lot more than you are a deal person or an ops person because you are selling yourself and you are selling a transition plan to a business owner. So leaned really heavily on some of the things that I learned in grad school and had a kind of multimodal outreach of cold email campaign, LinkedIn or other social media connectivity, and a fair bit of legit old school cold calling, picking up the phone, finding numbers and saying, can I speak to so-and-so?
Yeah.
Which for me was deeply, deeply uncomfortable. You build some thick skin after a couple hundred dials, but the first couple of times, I think the first time I did it, I was excited. But the second, third, fourth, I was dreading cold call day. I think
it's a real skill. I mean, it's one that I think 10 years ago wasn't held in the same regard, but the capacity to connect with someone and really create a relationship quickly is fascinating. I'm working with a sales organization now, and the guys at that firm who are the best at it, they are charming in everything that they do. I went to happy hour with one of them recently, and as we were walking in, he like very casually handed one of the guys like a handful of lures, bass fishing lures. It was the host at the door, just because he knew the guy liked fishing. There's no revenue coming behind that, but they just do it perpetually everywhere they go, building the biggest network they can. And I literally find myself studying them because it's so fascinating in terms of how good they are at opening doors. But at some point, building that skill set, you through this process, however you do it, I think it's one of the most advantageous things, and I'm sure it'll serve you well as you continue to build the company.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you use the word study and skill set because I was under the mistaken impression that salespeople were born, not made. There were just these some mythical people who were naturally gregarious and friendly, and everybody loved them, and they just gravitated into a sales environment. But there's a tremendous level of intentionality and study and thoughtfulness and reflection about what works, what doesn't. Having ways of making authentic connections, but also having lots and lots of preparation and work.
Absolutely.
And I think for folks like myself who didn't have an exposure to sales before, you just kind of gloss over it. You just assume some people are great at it and they can pick up the phone and strike up a conversation and get a deal done. And there's a ton of work that goes into the front end and the back end to facilitate that.
I absolutely agree. And I think you can become a salesperson in many different ways. There's a quote about Michael Burry studying everything that Warren Buffett did. Michael Burry being the famous investor who's one of the first to call the CDS trade, read everything Warren Buffett ever did and finally came back and said, that's not my style. I'm an investor. I really like terrible headlines, companies that have gotten thrashed, and that's where I thrive. Phenomenal investor. I think sales is the same way. You got to find the approach that naturally works with your personality and then practice it and hone it constantly. But it's immensely valuable and increasingly in a technology enabled age. So I don't know. I think it's people's misunderstanding about how much in-person contact's required to close a transaction is something that gets overlooked constantly. They focus on the model, the documentation, and they forget you're trying to convince someone who's built something over 10 years that you're the right guy to see it through the future. And in some capacity, you're trying to convince them to give up on some amount of financial reward if you're up against private equity firms. So the sales pitch is huge, and the relationship is huge.
Yeah.
But, well, I'm super curious. So after this very long process, you've now purchased your first company. How's your life changed?
Too much to put into words, but in short form, maybe it's no surprise, but being a small business owner is pretty all encompassing. There is not the same off switch that can potentially exist when you're an employee in a small business or a large business. I can't really put work in a little box and forget about it. It comes with me when I'm traveling. It comes with me when I'm up at night. It comes with me first thing when I wake up in the morning. And that can be really exciting because you feel very, very personally invested in the success of your team and the success of the company. The wins feel better and stronger. The highs are higher and the lows are lower, as one of my mentors would say. So the personal and professional has never been more intermingled. And it's an all-encompassing kind of journey.
And what about, I think, we won't go into your background here because we've gone into it in a different interview. But what about autonomy? You previously have worked at a lot of places. You had structure. You are now sort of, you're it. How does that feel going from employee, large structure, large organizations to you're kind of like, I understand you're there's no board. It's just you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just me in terms of, I suppose, ultimate decision making, but I'm not on an island in terms of I don't have a great team around me, which I do. So I do have several legitimate thought partners in the company. But that said, yes, the ultimate accountability, ultimate decision making authority, that all sits with me. The buck stops here, kind of thing. And
that feels good, or that feels daunting?
It's an ambivalent feeling. It feels tremendously good at sometimes. It was one of my primary motivators for pursuing search and pursuing small business ownership and entrepreneurship was to really live and die ultimately by my own decisions. Still have good advice and good input from others, but ultimately I'm going to call the shot and live with the consequences. That's thoroughly appealing. And also not having to deal with military or corporate bureaucracy of accountability for my physical presence or person, or justifying what I'm working on, or being told that the thing that I really believe is important and value additive is not, and that I need to focus elsewhere. So that feels tremendously empowering, really liberating, really exciting, and really lives up to the promise of search. Like, this is a good reason to do this professional path. But on the flip side, it's scary and it's hard to say that, yes, you're living by your decisions. You're going to die by your decisions too, especially in a small business context where you have potentially debt load to be mindful of. You, of course, have payroll to be mindful of, growth ambitions. Ultimately.
So let's talk about that. It's sort of day one after you buy your company. What are you doing day one in the first year?
Day one was an artificial soft on-ramp. Day two was where it really got started. So day two was the day that we made the announcement to the company that the transaction had happened. And here's who I am, what I'm about. This is the vision for the future.
And were the employees involved up to that point, or was that a surprise to everyone outside of the founder?
It was somewhere between the two. So there were kind of a select number of individuals who were kind of in the know on the transaction, but the overwhelming majority of the company, including some of the very senior members of the company, were surprised and did not know up to that point. That was the first they were hearing about it. We did something of a phased announcement where some of the founder and owners' direct reports who were not in the know were brought into the loop first. But that was a matter of hours before the whole company announcement and conversation.
And did you have any negative reactions to it?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How did you manage those? How do you deal with employees who are highly concerned and don't know what the future holds?
Yeah, so I think there's maybe two categories of negative reaction. One is negativity around the past, and one is negativity around the future. So the negativity around the past is I'm offended, I'm upset, I can't believe you did this without me, I can't believe you didn't tell me, I can't believe you didn't trust me, etc. And that's a relationship between that employee and the founder and owner of the company.
Yeah.
And that's difficult for you to have a positive impact on. But you're gonna bear out the consequences, because at some point that employee is gonna stay, hopefully, and the founder is gonna leave, and some of that resentment and negativity will get transferred to the new owner, the new leader. And I think the best way to address that is to just continue to try to lead with empathy and understanding, and say like, yes, this, I'm sure this took you by surprise, and then try to explain things from the seller's point of view. As much as that seller may not be doing it themselves, is that it's not a lack of trust. It's a very sensitive transaction. There is a need for some control of information flow, et cetera. But the one that I think I handled better, and the one that I think I understand better, is negativity and concern around the future. Because this is this kind of announcement for a company that's always had one owner, always had one leader for 10 plus years. The company is inextricably tied to the founder. So when that founder, when that owner makes an announcement of, hey, I've sold the company, I'm leaving on 6 months, 9 months transition plan, there's a ton of anxiety and trepidation about what is that on each employee's basis of what does this mean for me? Do I have a job? Is my job safe? Are the terms of my employment going to change radically? Is this business gonna, I'm really happy. Is this new person going to ruin a good thing?
Yeah.
So I
heavy communication, I imagine.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time individually, spent a lot of time with mentors and others who had done this before, had made that day one announcement or day two announcement.
You've mentioned mentors a few times. I'm curious, in this search process, did you develop sort of a mini board of directors to help you through it?
Yeah, I'd like to think I've got something of an unofficial advisory board. Folks I've met along the way through professional experience, grad school, or just exposure to the search community. It's pretty insular, it's pretty niche, and I've developed some really strong relationships with people I really respect, both as people and as very successful small business owners and leaders. So there's probably a half dozen or so folks who I can call up and say, hey, I'm struggling with a thorny issue, or there is a big momentous thing that I've got to do soon, namely day one announcement. This is how I'm thinking through it. Do you have any advice, or can you talk to me about your experiences?
Yeah, I imagine it helps a lot to have that confidence. Is that where you're kind of outsourcing confidence a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. Even if you're going about it wrong, or you're not perfect, just having somebody who says like, yes, I've been through that, I've done that too. It wasn't perfect, but we got through it. Or here was my one near fatal flaw or mistake. Watch out for that, and beyond that, you'll be fine. It is outsource confidence. I like that.
Yeah, that's terrific. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail. So going back to your first year owning a new business, how did you think about your first year and then your second year, and how's the business performed over that timeline? What were your priorities?
Yeah, I think priorities are pretty different in a real small business rather than maybe lower middle market type transaction, and as an individual entrepreneur rather than a firm, where a lot of those firms come in with very rigorous 90-day plans. We've got a playbook. We're going to airdrop in a new CFO, rip and replace ERP, etc. I had day one hypotheses of thoughts of things that were going fine for the business but could go much better. But my biggest priority for 6 months or longer was just learning the business, learning much deeper the ins and outs of the industry, learning the working norms of our customers, really understanding internal processes, and understanding, strengths and weaknesses of the team. So spent a ton of time sitting, listening, asking questions, dissecting, why did this decision get made this way? Why do we do this? How does this work? What does this mean? Tons and tons of questions before developing a firm opinion to start making changes. So the first year, absolutely. I would say, was a year of learning and making pretty modest and minor tweaks only where things were obviously broken or there was a very easy quick win. And then getting into year 2 and beyond is where we started making more substantial changes of hiring in certain capabilities, developing certain capabilities internally, making tech stack changes, things in that vein. And I'm not sure, a couple of years in, not sure I did it right, to be perfectly honest.
But I think that's the luxury of a really long time horizon. Private equity firms are generally looking at a very short time horizon. They need to make changes quickly. You have a very long time horizon. I'm personally always much more a fan of evergreen investing, very long-term time horizons, because you don't have to make mistakes. You don't have to force them. There's no forced errors, right? You can spend time understanding risk, understanding the business. And I think there's a lot to that that's so valuable. Actually, it just reminded me, I listened to the Acquired podcast for Hermes recently, and there was a time where Hermes was like in significant trouble, and they brought in a whole bunch of outside analysts, and they told him, multiply the number of SKUs, drop your price, make it more accessible, and get rid of all your in-house manufacturing, which is what fashion was doing at the time. And Hermes at that moment decided that they would never hire an outside consultant again, because they're demonstrating what best practices are for an industry, and best practices by their nature are in some way average. And you look at Hermes today, they kept all of their manufacturing. Their products are extraordinarily difficult to get, and they're one of the most successful fashion companies in the world. So you have to know what about the history of the company made it so successful. And if you make changes initially, I don't think you get the benefit of that. I think it's really powerful, honestly. I mean, I know you're being hard on yourself saying maybe you did some things wrong, but I think there's a lot about that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think everyone makes mistakes, and everyone, some people, if you had somebody else on who made radical changes quickly, they may have said, "Hey, I moved too fast." But I do think that some folks have just a tremendous bias to action. Others have bias toward analysis. I think in general, it's good to try to keep those two in balance. Is to not walk in day one, I'm the hero, savior of this small business. I'm going to fix everything, change everything in the first 10 days. But also not be afraid to make changes, not be afraid to break some eggs and say, yes, I am a capable professional. I've heard you. I've learned things about this business, and I'm not afraid to make changes.
Yeah. I think a culture of change is important. And if you have a culture of change where everyone's aligned, you can make small changes. And if ever you do something incorrect, there's always the opportunity to come out and say, we're pulling this back. But if you don't have a culture of change, you're stuck in a situation where you have to make big changes every once in a while. And it's almost more difficult, I think, in my opinion. I'm curious. I think most people thinking about doing this find the prospect of raising capital to buy a business extraordinarily daunting. And I'd love to know how you approached it.
It can be really intimidating. If you have never asked someone for money before, for an investment, it's tough to make that first ask. I think there are a handful of things that you can do to better prepare yourself and increase your chances of success. And in general, I'll start off by saying I rolled my eyes at this when other folks who were further along in the process told me, but it was very much my experience, and it is true. You just have to believe the folks who have been there and done that before you. If you have a good deal, if you have structured a good deal for a fair price for a quality company, raising money will not be your obstacle. It will not be that
Absolutely.
hard. It will be okay. That said, let's get into what the process is. For your run-of-the-mill small business transaction, you're probably looking at 3 sources of funding for one essential use of funding. So 3 sources being senior debt, probably some amount of debt carried over by the seller of the business, and an equity raise. all of that going into, not quite all, but a majority of that going into the acquisition of the business. Of course, you have transaction costs and other things associated. But basically, think of those three buckets of money going into one big bucket that's right back into the seller's pocket. The seller financing is just part of the deal negotiation. That part's pretty straightforward. There are semi-loose market terms for these 5 to 10 million enterprise value companies, where the seller is generally willing to take some percentage of the purchase price and deferred comp. So that part's checked. Then you get into debt and equity. I think it's tremendously valuable and helpful to get familiar with the landscape of debt before you start making offers on businesses and understand what basic terms are in terms of total lending capacity, amortization, rate, et cetera. So you have at least a general idea of how much debt you could put on the business.
And how did you do that? What was your process for understanding what was available in the market versus what the business could tolerate?
Yeah, so I think there's two paths to do that. One is to do a kind of a network search through folks who have done this before and ask, hey, who do you bank with? Who did you consider getting debt from? Can you make any introductions? And then two is there are a handful of banks that do education in this space. I think one, just to support the ecosystem in general, and two, as a fair bit of lead gen.
Oh, interesting. Which banks are those for people listening?
The first one that comes to mind is Live Oak Bank. They do a tremendous amount of education and writing in the ETA space. And they have a small, but I think kind of robust little mini education program on how small business finance works and how small business debt works. And if you walk through that process, that I think is only a few hours commitment, they'll generally have you on kind of a short list where if you bring them a deal, they know that you are not wildly uneducated and that they've already kind of walked you through some of the basic norms and terms. So I think debt is pretty formulaic at the end of the day, it relies on making some phone calls, sitting in on some info sessions, and having a short list Rolodex of bankers you want to put a rough deal in front of to get a gut check of what's going to be available. And then that'll inform, what's possible will set your upper bound. And then what is reasonable will be dictated by your own financial and operating model. And then you land on, okay, I've got my two sources of debt, my bank debt, my senior, and my seller debt, my subordinated debt. So you got to raise equity. And I'll admit I had some really significant advantages in the equity raise process that kind of greased the wheels. And that was the fact that I had been very intentional about searching for several years by the time that I had found a deal. So I had this ability to develop relationships and develop trust and develop credibility by phone calls and classroom sessions and in-person coffee chats and meals and this, that, and the other, to have a decently long list of folks who had either told me, hey, when you find a deal, give me a call, I'll give it a look, or I may know someone, I can pass your name around.
So would you say, like, in addition, equal effort into search as you did into letting people know what you were doing so that they would be there when the transaction came?
I put way, way, way more effort into the search.
Okay.
The search, I would say that was 80-20 or 90-10. I tried to do it authentically rather than, having this, spam list that I would send out an update to every once in a while. I know some people do that, and some investors like to see that. They like to be brought along in the process and have a check-in, and it offers the searcher a lot of scale versus having to have 20 or 30 individual conversations. But I would try to check in with people and kind of keep warm and pick their brain on this or that deal. But I didn't have a particularly structured or rigorous cadence about making sure I was on people's mind.
If you have a terrific network, it may be less necessary, but I find, so I've interacted with a few independent sponsors who actively develop newsletters to detail their process, and they hope that it will continue to expand. They'll send it out biweekly, monthly, talk about the deals they turned down, and that helps them build their network if they don't have the network previously established. I think you came from a lot of environments where it's more of an understood concept, but I've seen a lot of very very unique and curious, interesting ways of getting the word out and developing that network with social media and technology and emails now.
Yeah, I think I benefited a lot from a several years long transition into searching, where as I was getting educated in what search was, how to do it, how to be successful in it, that naturally helped me develop relationships with folks who were inclined to invest in the space. And then, of course, you go back to your broader professional network of folks that you had worked with, at other companies, developed trust, developed credibility, and they know exactly who you are and what you can do, and that you're worth backing and supporting. And maybe they're 5, 10, 20 years ahead of you in their career, and they're in a position to do that.
So having gone through the process of buying a company, what would you do differently if you were to go back and start over?
I'd probably try to break it down into the search phase, just in general, looking for businesses and trying to identify and hone in on one. And then the acquisition phase, where we were in a live deal with the company that I ultimately bought. In the search phase in general, I focus too much on process. So Royce, Professor Royce Yudkoff, is an HBS professor, one of the ones who taught me, is running now with his co-professor Rick Ruback a podcast called Think Big, Buy Small. And a session a few weeks, maybe a few months ago now, they had some really good thoughts on overemphasis on process and trying to craft the perfect website and the perfect tech stack and the perfect name for your search entity. And honestly, I fell victim to this too. I think the best way to do it is just roll up your sleeves, get to work.
You're saying it's almost a procrastination effort, like coming up with the name, the website, business cards. It's like just start making calls and getting the word out.
I think that's a really good term for it versus, thinking and planning and preparing for months. I did have the benefit of being a student in business school as a little bit of a buffer there, so I could chip away at it. But yeah, a lot of wasted time just procrastinating. I think that's a perfect word for it. So from the search phase, just get into it, start doing stuff once you have developed conviction, and then check and adjust as needed. And then in the acquisition phase, my number one mistake far and away was insufficient diligence of the team. So I think sellers are often very understandably reticent to let the whole team know, or let even a significant portion of their direct reports, the senior leadership team, know that a transaction is coming. It's an understandably fraught and tense time in a company's life cycle and journey. And for a lot of small business owners, this is their retirement plan. This is their net worth, the sum total of it. So anything that could spook their team or cause the deal to go awry, it's nothing nefarious. I think it's just a very genuine sense of anxiety about too much information sharing and what if this doesn't work out. I inherited a really, really strong team overall. I'm very pleased with the overall composition of the team, but I could have saved some serious headache and heartache by knowing or identifying some of the big personalities and some of the big personnel challenges were likely to happen, and working with the seller ahead of time to try to head those off. I would push extraordinarily hard to, at a minimum, get with every single one of the seller's direct reports and make sure they're aware and make sure that you can start to develop a relationship before, poof, day one, I'm your new boss.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice.
It's a difficult place to build trust from. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult.
Absolutely. One thing I really love about your story is how it's sort of become a family affair. So as I understand it, your wife helped you through the first search process. Now you've closed, you're in this excellent position, and she's now considering going through the same thing?
Yeah, more than considering. She is actively doing it, and more than helped me through my first process. She was you could call her the primary instigator, and certainly investor number one.
That's badass.
So she bought me. Yeah. So when I got into school, she bought me a copy of Rick and Royce's book. The what's it called? I've got it on my shelf. The Harvard Business Review Guide to Buying a Small Business. So she bought me that book and said, "Hey, I think you should read this. I think this could really speak to you." Yeah, about as subtle as a sledgehammer. But yeah, it kind of started me on the journey, certainly supported me mentally, emotionally as kind of a business thought partner and financially through the searching phase. And then, yes, acquired about 2.5 years ago. Things have fortunately gotten pretty stable, are going pretty well. And we've got this, thought about our relationship and how that ties into our professional goals of kind of your turn, my turn. So she took
That's so awesome.
the more stable, predictable route to support me doing this more entrepreneurial, risky thing. And now that my entrepreneurial risky thing is a little less risky, a little more stable, we're flipping that. And yeah, she's raised her own fund, and she is actively looking for a business to buy.
Oh, cool, man. We'll have to do a follow up when you both are both not even dual income,
both running different businesses. Yeah.
Dual company owner family. That's very, very awesome. Love to hear that. Well, very cool. Mason, before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to say to the veteran ASM or searcher community?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again for having me on. It's fun as always, but I will make a quick plug. So for any veterans or active duty, transitioning service members interested in ETA, please reach out. We are in the midst of setting up a skill bridge program for folks who are getting out, and we're likely going to run a summer internship as well for current MBA students. So if you're at or going to start at or potentially pursuing one of these top business school programs and you're interested in getting a taste of what ETA, search, and small business life are like, drop me a line.
That's awesome. Mason, really appreciate you making the time. Wish you even more success in the future. If anyone's interested in contacting Mason about future opportunities, I'll be sure to include a link in his LinkedIn profile. But buddy, thank you, man. This has been awesome.
Thanks, Peter. Fun as always.